The wind howled through the dense pine trees, rattling their needle-covered branches as a storm brewed in the distance. Dark clouds stretched across the sky, and a thin layer of mist settled over the land, casting an eerie silence over the wilderness. The forest, usually alive with the distant calls of birds and the rustling of unseen creatures, felt strangely muted, almost as if nature itself was holding its breath. Inside a small wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, Olivia Carter paced anxiously across the creaking floorboards. The dim glow of a lantern flickered against the walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the room. But Olivia had no time to notice any of it. Her entire focus was on the fragile creature lying motionless on the table before her. A bobcat. Its once powerful body was now weak and trembling, its golden fur matted with dirt and dried blood. The animal's breaths came in shallow gasps, and its once vibrant amber eyes were now dull, filled with exhaustion and pain. A thick bandage wrapped around his front leg, barely concealing the deep wound beneath. His name was Ash. For years, Olivia had worked as a wildlife rescuer, tending to injured animals and rehabilitating them before releasing them back into the wild. But Ash wasn't just any rescue, he was special. She had found him as an abandoned cub, weak and starving, his mother nowhere in sight. Against all odds, she had raised him, nursed him back to health, and watched him grow into a strong, majestic bobcat. Though he had eventually returned to the wild, he always found his way back to her cabin, as if a piece of him still belonged there. But now, the bond they had built over the years seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Olivia's hands trembled as she reached out, gently stroking the soft fur behind Ash's ears. He barely reacted. "Come on, Ash," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've always been a fighter. You have to hold on." The storm outside rumbled louder, sending a shiver down Olivia's spine. She had seen animals fight through impossible odds before, but Ash's condition was dire. He had been found deep in the woods, wounded, likely attacked by another predator. The local veterinarian had done what they could, but the prognosis was grim. He was slipping away. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she knelt beside the table, resting her forehead against his. His fur was still warm, but his heartbeat was weak, barely perceptible beneath her fingertips. Was this the end? She had always known that wild animals couldn't stay forever, that one day Ash would fully return to the wilderness. But not like this, not with his life fading in front of her eyes. A deep, aching grief settled in her chest as she clenched her fists. "I won't let you go," she whispered fiercely. But nature was cruel, and it did not bend to the will of humans. Ash's breathing grew shallower, his body barely rising and falling. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she wiped at her tears. She had to do something, anything. Desperation took hold. She rummaged through the supplies scattered on her table, bandages, medicine, anything that could help. But she knew deep down that it wasn't enough. Then, a faint sound. A weak, raspy breath from Ash. His dull eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked at her. A sob caught in Olivia's throat. He was still fighting. She took his paw in her hands, squeezing it gently. "You're not alone," she whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I'm here." The storm raged on outside, rain hammering against the cabin roof, but inside, everything felt frozen in time. Olivia refused to leave his side, watching, waiting, praying for a miracle, because she wasn't ready to say goodbye. The rain drummed relentlessly against the cabin's wooden roof, each drop echoing in Olivia's ears like a countdown she refused to acknowledge. The dim lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Ash lay still on the table, his breathing faint but present, a fragile thread tethering him to life. Olivia clenched her fists, staring at the injured bobcat. She refused to lose him. She wiped the tears from her face, steeling herself. If there was even the smallest chance of saving Ash, she had to take it. But time was slipping away. The last hope, she forced herself to think. What could she do that she hadn't already tried? The vet had given her antibiotics and painkillers, but Ash was too weak to eat or drink on his own. His body was shutting down. Then it hit her. Fluids. He was dehydrated. His body wasn't strong enough to fight, but maybe, just maybe, if she could rehydrate him, It would give him the strength to survive. Olivia rushed to the wooden cabinet where she kept emergency supplies. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a small 4 bag filled with sterile fluids. She had used them before for other rescues, but Ash had never needed one. Until now. She carefully hooked up the 4, her breath shallow as she slid the thin needle beneath the skin. Ash didn't move, didn't react, as if he had already accepted his fate. "No," Olivia muttered under her breath. "You're not giving up." She secured the 4 in place, ensuring the fluids began flowing. It wasn't a cure, but it was something, a small act of defiance against the cruel hands of fate. Then she waited. Minutes passed. The storm raged on, shaking the cabin walls. Olivia barely noticed. Her entire world narrowed to the frail body of the Bobcat before her. She watched his breathing, his heartbeat, searching for any sign that he was still fighting. The fluid dripped steadily into his body, replenishing what he had lost. But was it enough? The desperate plea. She swallowed hard, pressing her forehead against the table beside him. She had spent years in this forest, saving creatures from the brink of death, but she had never felt this helpless before. "Ash," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need you to fight." Her hands curled into fists. He had to fight. Memories flashed in her mind of the first time she had found him. A tiny, shivering cub, barely a few weeks old, abandoned beneath the roots of an old oak tree. His mother had likely been killed, and he had been left to starve. But Olivia had scooped him up, warmed his frail body against her chest, and vowed that she would protect him. She had raised him, watched him grow into a powerful predator, only for him to come back to her time and time again. He had always chosen her. And now, when it mattered most, she was powerless. Tears slipped down her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't lose you." The words felt heavy, raw, as if they were pulled straight from her soul. And then, a flicker of movement, a faint twitch in his paw. Olivia's breath caught. "Ash!" For the first time in hours, his ears shifted slightly. A spark of hope ignited in her chest. She grabbed a damp cloth and gently wiped his face, careful not to disturb his injury. His fur was still warm, his body still fighting, no matter how weak he seemed. He wasn't gone. Not yet. A faint light in the darkness. Hours passed. The storm outside slowly began to settle, the violent winds turning into a soft drizzle. The cabin was eerily silent, save for the slow, steady rhythm of Ash's breathing. Then, as dawn's first light crept through the window, a sound, a low, barely audible rumble. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She stared at Ash, hardly daring to believe it. It was a purr, weak, almost non-existent, but it was there. Tears blurred her vision. He was still here. He was fighting. And maybe, just maybe, he would win. The morning light seeped through the cabin's wooden windows, casting soft golden hues across the room. Olivia sat beside Ash, exhaustion weighing heavy on her, but she didn't dare close her eyes. She had stayed awake all night, watching over him, waiting, hoping. And then it happened, a small shift in his body. At first, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of her sleep-deprived mind. But then his paw moved again just slightly, his claws flexing as if testing their strength. "Ash?" she whispered, barely breathing. His ear twitched. A sudden rush of relief flooded her, tears welling in her eyes. He was coming back. She reached out, brushing her fingers over his fur. His body was still weak, his breathing shallow, but there was something new in him, a spark that hadn't been there before. He wasn't giving up. The first signs of life. She rushed to prepare a small bowl of water, carefully lifting his head to help him drink. His tongue barely flicked at the liquid, his movements sluggish, but it was enough. It meant he wanted to live. For the next few hours, Olivia tended to him with gentle hands, cleaning his wounds, checking his fur, whispering soft reassurances. "You're doing great," she murmured. "Just keep fighting." The hours passed in a fragile balance between hope and uncertainty. Ash would stir every now and then, his eyes fluttering open for brief moments before exhaustion pulled him under again. But then something changed. The miracle begins. That afternoon, as Olivia sat beside him, she noticed something strange. His body, which had been deathly still for so long, suddenly tensed. His muscles rippled, a faint tremor running through him. And then his golden eyes opened, wide, alert, alive. Olivia gasped, her heart pounding. Ash! He blinked slowly, his pupils adjusting to the light. For the first time in days, his gaze locked onto hers, not with a haze of sickness, not with a dullness of defeat, but with something stronger, recognition. She let out a shaky breath, a sob of relief breaking past her lips. "You're back," she whispered. Ash let out a weak, breathy chuff, his way of responding. It was small, it was fragile, but it was there, defying the odds. Olivia knew what the vet had told her. Bobcats didn't survive injuries like this. Even if they did, their strength never fully returned. But Ash had never been ordinary. He had always been a fighter, pushing the limits of what should have been possible. And now, he was proving them all wrong. The next few hours were filled with cautious hope. She offered him tiny pieces of shredded meat, and though he barely had the strength to chew, he tried. She helped him shift his position, easing his body into a more comfortable spot. His muscles were weak, his limbs trembling under the weight of his own body. But she saw it, the determination burning behind his tired eyes. "You're not done yet, are you?" Olivia whispered, running her fingers gently through his fur. Ash let out another faint rumble, his version of a purr. The unspoken bond. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp, cool breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and pine to the open window. Olivia sat beside Ash, stroking his fur absent-mindedly. She thought back to all the times she had watched him in the wild, how he had moved with effortless grace, a king of the forest, untouchable. And yet, when he had been at his weakest, he had chosen to come to her, not to the shadows of the wilderness, not to the call of instinct, but to her. That realization struck her harder than she expected. He had trusted her with his life. And now, against all odds, he was fighting to stay. Olivia took a deep breath, wiping the dampness from her eyes. She wasn't going to let him down. Not now. Not ever. A new beginning. The night settled in once more, but this time the cabin didn't feel so heavy with fear. Ash was still weak, still fragile, but he was here, alive. And for the first time since she found him on her doorstep, Olivia allowed herself to believe this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Something impossible. Something miraculous. The moon hung high over the cabin, casting silver streaks of light across the wooden floor. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, remnants of the passing storm. Inside, Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor beside Ash, watching his slow, rhythmic breathing. Every rise and fall of his chest was a miracle. It had been 2 days since he first opened his eyes. 2 days of fragile progress. He was fighting, but the battle was far from over. The struggle to stand. The morning came with a crisp bite in the air. Ash stirred beside her, his large paws twitching as if chasing something in a dream. Olivia smiled, but then he moved. Not just a twitch, not just a stir. His front legs pressed against the floor. He was trying to get up. Olivia's breath caught. "Ash, wait, not yet." But the bobcat didn't listen. His muscles trembled. His claws scraped against the wooden floor, and with a shaky exhale he pushed, lifting his body for the first time. He barely made it an inch before his strength gave out. His legs buckled, and he collapsed back onto the blankets. Olivia rushed forward, her hands hovering near him, unsure whether to intervene. His sides heaved, his body trembling from exertion. But his eyes, they burned with frustration. "I know," Olivia murmured, stroking his fur gently. "You hate feeling weak, but you have to take it slow." Ash let out a soft growl, a whispered defiance. It was the first sound of real determination she had heard from him since the night he arrived. A fighter's heart. For the next few hours, Olivia watched as Ash stubbornly tried again and again. Each time, he lifted himself a little higher. Each time, he held himself up for a little longer. But each time his body betrayed him. His limbs would give out, forcing him back onto blankets. Olivia felt her chest tighten. She could see how much he hated this. He wasn't meant to be weak. He was meant to run, leap, and rule the wild. But now, the world had taken that from him. She pressed a hand to her face, swallowing hard. No, she wouldn't let that happen. "Ash," she whispered, cupping his face gently, her thumb brushing against the soft fur near his cheek. His golden eyes locked onto hers. "We're going to get you back on your feet." A pause, then a slow blink. He understood. The first steps. That evening, Olivia devised a plan. If Ash wanted to walk, he would, but he wouldn't do it alone. She gathered soft towels and made a makeshift sling. It wasn't perfect, but it would support his weight just enough to take the pressure off his fragile muscles. At first, he resisted. Pride. But then, when she gently wrapped it under his belly and lifted, something changed. He stood. For the first time in weeks, Ash was on his feet. His legs trembled violently, and Olivia held most of his weight. But he was standing. A deep, rumbling growl came from his throat, not one of pain, but of determination. One step, then another. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pressed forward, leaning against Olivia's support. "You're doing it," she whispered, barely able to contain her emotions. "You're really doing it." They moved slowly across the small space of the cabin. Olivia adjusted her grip, careful not to strain him too much, but also let him feel his own strength. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't graceful, but it was progress, the price of recovery. The next few days passed in a blur of slow, but steady improvement. Every morning, Olivia would help Ash stand. Every afternoon, they would take careful, measured steps across the room. And every night, Olivia would sit beside him, whispering soft reassurances as he drifted into an exhausted sleep. But healing wasn't just about strength. There were setbacks. Some nights, Ash refused to eat. Some mornings, he wouldn't even lift his head, his body too drained from the effort of the previous day. And there were moments when Olivia wondered if she was pushing him too hard. But then, just when doubt crept in, Ash would prove her wrong. One night, as she was preparing to lift him for their usual walk, he suddenly stood up on his own. No support, no sling, just him. He was shaky, his legs quivering under his weight, but his eyes burned with fierce, unwavering willpower. Olivia covered her mouth, her chest tightening. He was doing this. He was really doing this. And then he took a step. On his own. One step turned into two, then three, then four. And by the time he reached the other side of the cabin, Olivia was crying, not from sadness, not from fear, but from overwhelming, breathtaking hope, a heart that refuses to break. That night, as Ash lay beside her, Olivia ran her fingers through his fur, her voice soft. "You're incredible, you know that," she murmured. Ash let out a low chuff, the warmth of his breath brushing against her hand. She smiled. "You're going to be okay." She wasn't just saying it this time. She believed it. Outside, the trees whispered in the cool night breeze. The stars shimmered, casting soft light over the world. And in that moment, Olivia knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a comeback. And Ash wasn't finished yet. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, filling the small cabin with a crisp freshness. Olivia stretched, rubbing the stiffness from her neck as she turned toward Ash's sleeping form. But he wasn't there. Her heart jumped. The blankets were empty, the small space beside the fireplace cold. She turned quickly, and there he was. Ash was standing near the window, his golden eyes fixed on the forest outside. His tail twitched slightly, ears perked forward, and for the first time in weeks, he looked like himself. Olivia didn't speak right away. She just watched. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a wounded animal fighting to stay alive anymore. This was a predator remembering who he was, testing the limits. The wooden floor creaked beneath Olivia's step as she approached. Ash turned slightly, acknowledging her presence, but his gaze remained locked on the trees. "You're feeling stronger today," Olivia murmured. A slow blink. Yes, for the past week, he had been walking with her help, but today he had gotten up on his own. "Let's test something." She walked to the cabin door and opened it, letting the crisp morning air seep inside. Ash's nose twitched as the wild scent of damp leaves and fresh earth rushed in. His muscles tensed. This was home. But Wade took a step forward. He faltered. His body wasn't ready yet. Olivia stepped beside him, steadying him without touching. "You'll get there." His tail flicked once. He didn't like being weak, so she gave him something to focus on. Reaching into a small wooden crate near the fireplace, she pulled out a thin piece of raw meat, something she'd been feeding him as he regained his strength. Ash's ears twitched, but he didn't lunge like he once might have. Instead, he crouched. A deep, familiar instinct kicked in. His muscles bunched. His gaze locked onto the meat in Olivia's hand. He wanted to hunt again. Olivia tossed the piece onto the wooden floor a few feet away. Ash hesitated, then took a careful step. Then another. He was stalking. His steps were unsteady, but his focus was razor-sharp. And then he pounced. It wasn't graceful. His back leg buckled slightly, and he landed a bit awkwardly, but he did it. For the first time since the accident, he had chased something. Olivia swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. He was coming back to life. A taste of the wild. For the next few days, Olivia continued to test Ash's strength. Each day, she opened a cabin door, allowing him to feel the cool air, hear the rustling leaves, smell the damp earth. Each day, she placed his food farther and farther away, encouraging him to hunt it. And each day, he grew stronger. The first time he leapt onto the couch, Olivia nearly cried. It wasn't high, just a short jump, but it was something. The second time, he made it with ease. And the third time, he didn't hesitate at all. The call of the forest. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Olivia sat outside with Ash curled beside her. His fur was thick and warm against her leg, his body strong once more. But his eyes were elsewhere. The forest called to him. She could see it. The longing, the hunger to run, to hunt, to be free. Olivia's heart clenched. She had always known this moment would come. Still, she whispered, "Not yet." He blinked, slow and patient, but she knew. He was waiting, not for his body to heal, for her to let go, a bond that would never break. That night, Olivia lay beside Ash one last time, her fingers threading gently through his fur. She had saved his life, but he had changed hers. She had never imagined this, caring for something wild, something fierce. But now, she couldn't imagine life without him. And yet, she knew she had to say goodbye. Ash didn't belong in a cabin. He belonged out there, free. The final test. The next morning, Olivia stepped outside and left the cabin door open behind her. Ash watched her from the threshold, his golden eyes filled with something unreadable. She didn't speak. She just waited. The wind rustled through the trees. A bird called in the distance. The forest was waking up. And then Ash stepped forward, one paw on the cold dirt, then another. He stood there, the wild surrounding him, the cabin behind him. A choice. Olivia held her breath. Ash turned his head slightly, golden eyes locking onto hers. A slow blink, a silent goodbye. Then he ran. His body moved like it had never been broken, his muscles stretching, his paws barely touching the earth as he leapt into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole. And just like that, he was gone. Olivia exhaled slowly, blinking away the sting in her eyes. He had done the impossible. And though he had left, she knew he would never be far, because some bonds are never truly broken. The cabin felt emptier than ever. For the first time in weeks, Olivia woke up without the sound of steady breathing beside her. No soft huff of warm air against her skin. No golden eyes watching her with quiet intelligence. Ash was gone. She sat up slowly, her heart heavy, eyes drifting to the open door. Beyond it, the forest stretched wide and endless, the trees whispering secrets in the morning breeze. Somewhere out there, Ash was running, hunting, living as he was always meant to. It was what she had wanted. But why did it hurt so much? She had prepared herself for this. But now, in the quiet of the empty cabin, she wasn't sure how to move forward. A lingering presence. The days that followed felt hollow. She still found herself setting aside food, as if he might come trotting back inside. Still glanced toward the window, expecting to see his familiar shape, but he didn't return. At night, she swore she heard rustling near the trees, the soft snap of a branch, the whisper of movement just beyond her sight. Was it him? Or was it just her heart playing tricks on her? One evening, as the sun painted the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, Olivia sat on the porch, staring into the woods. "Ash," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Silence. She let out a small, broken laugh. "Guess you really moved on, huh?" And then a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A presence. She turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. Golden eyes. Just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, he stood, silent, watching. Olivia's breath caught. She couldn't move, couldn't blink. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. She didn't call out to him. She didn't step forward. She just let him be, because she understood. He wasn't here to stay. He was here to say goodbye. One last time. The impossible moment. Ash took one slow step forward. Then another. Her breath hitched as he closed the distance between them, until he was standing just a few feet away, his wild scent filling her senses. And then he did something she never expected. He lowered his head. For just a second, just long enough for her fingers to brush against his fur one last time. A single, silent thank you. Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wouldn't make this harder for him. So instead, she smiled. "Go," she whispered. Ash lifted his head, met her gaze, and then he turned and ran. This time, she didn't watch until he disappeared. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her heart. It wasn't loss. It wasn't pain. It was peace, because some souls were never meant to be tamed, and some bonds were never meant to break. Months passed. Seasons changed. The cabin felt different now, not empty, but full of something else. Memories. Everywhere Olivia looked, she saw traces of him. The place where he had once curled up by the fire, the scratches on the old wooden door from his restless nights. And even though he was gone, he wasn't. One autumn morning, as she stepped outside with a fresh cup of coffee, she felt it again. That presence, a soft rustle in the trees. She turned, but there was nothing there, nothing but the wind. Still she smiled, because somehow she knew, somewhere out there in the vast stretch of the wild, Ash was watching, and he always would be.